My son banned me from his wedding photos, and that very same day I cut him out of my will. What kind of child erases his own parent from the happiest day of his life? The words still echo in my mind like a wound that refuses to heal. I had imagined standing beside him, smiling proudly as cameras flashed, our bond captured in images meant to last for generations. Instead, I was pushed aside, treated as though I were a blemish, an embarrassment to be hidden away. He did not whisper it gently or frame it as some unfortunate necessity. He said it coldly, with authority, like he was removing an inconvenience from his perfect portrait. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My heart clenched as I stepped back, the laughter of guests surrounding me like a cruel soundtrack to my humiliation, and I felt the heat of eyes upon me, some filled with pity, others with confusion, all of them bearing witness to the moment my own son erased me. I walked away slowly, my legs heavy as if chained by the years of sacrifice I carried within me. Every memory flooded back in sharp detail. The nights I stayed awake after long shifts, saving pennies to buy him new clothes while I wore shoes with holes. The meals I skipped so he could eat more. The times I encouraged his dreams even when they felt impossible to me. I had been the foundation of his life, the one constant in his climb toward the man he had become, and now, at the pinnacle of his joy, he chose to strip me from the picture, as though my presence diminished his happiness, instead of being the very reason it existed. What kind of man does that to the person who raised him? What kind of son treats his father as a disposable object? I felt the humiliation burn hotter than any flame, but beneath the pain something else began to stir. It was clarity. It was finality. As the crowd moved on with their smiles and poses, I understood in one piercing moment that if he could erase me from his photographs, then he could just as easily erase me from his future. And if that was his choice, then I would give him the same gift in return. He had severed me from the memories he wanted to cherish, so I would sever him from the legacy I had built. That very same day, without hesitation, I cut him out of my will. This was not a rash decision born of anger, nor was it some petty attempt to strike back. No, it was deliberate, the natural conclusion of years of being taken for granted, of being seen not as a father but as a resource, a wallet, a man whose worth ended where his usefulness stopped. I sat with that truth and embraced it. If I did not belong in his future, then he would not belong in mine. The pen that scratched across the paper later that day did more than alter legal documents. It restored my dignity. He thought he had cut me from a picture, but in reality, he had cut himself from everything that truly mattered. That was the day I stopped being just a father who endured and became a man who refused to be erased. The moment that broke me began with a smile that was not meant for me. I stood there among the crowd of guests, watching as the photographer arranged the bride's family into neat little rows, every face glowing with pride and excitement. Her parents were ushered forward first, her siblings close behind, laughter and chatter filling the air as if the day belonged only to them. I waited, foolishly expecting to be called over, to stand beside my son the way I always imagined. After all, I was his father. I had raised him, guided him, sacrificed for him, but the call never came. Instead, when I shifted a step forward, ready to join, he turned to me with a look that froze me in place. His voice was sharp, clipped, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Not you, Dad. Step aside." For a moment I thought I had misheard him, thought perhaps he meant just this one set of photos, and that he would call me in for the next. But then he waved his hand dismissively, as though brushing off a nuisance, his eyes never meeting mine. The photographer hesitated, glancing between us with clear discomfort, but my son's tone left no room for argument. He said it again, firmer this time. "Step aside. We'll take these without you." There was no trace of hesitation, no flicker of guilt or compassion. He spoke as if he were talking to a stranger, as if the man who had given him life was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. The bride's family welcomed the instruction without pause, moving in close to him, their arms wrapped around one another, smiles widening as the camera clicked. I stood off to the side, rooted to the ground, unable to believe what had just happened. I saw his new in-laws beam with satisfaction, their family whole and complete, while I was left like a shadow on the fringe of their happiness. They had been granted center stage, celebrated and cherished, while I was told I had no place. The pain cut deeper with every flash of the camera, every click capturing a moment I was denied. What burned most was not just being excluded, but the way he did it, like I was an inconvenience, like my presence would taint his perfect picture. There was no apology, no explanation, no softening of the blow, only a cold command delivered without hesitation, and the ease with which he dismissed me made it clear this was not a mistake. This was a choice. He wanted me gone. He wanted me erased. I felt the humiliation crawl across my skin as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some turned away, not wanting to watch, while others let their pity show plainly in their eyes. I stood there, stripped of dignity, betrayed by the very person I had devoted my life to. The air grew heavy in my lungs, and for a brief moment I thought I might collapse. But I held myself together, silent and still, because if this was the way he wished to treat me, then I would give him the dignity of my quiet departure. I stepped back, but in that retreat, a seed of something darker took root inside me. He thought he was erasing me from a photograph, but what he didn't realize was that he was erasing himself from something far greater. I stood frozen where I had been cast aside, my body betraying me as the reality of his words sank in. My hands trembled uncontrollably, as though every nerve had been jolted awake, and I pressed them together to hide the shaking, though the effort only made my chest tighter. A sharp weight pressed against my ribs, each breath harder to draw, as though the air itself refused to let me live in that moment. My eyes burned and blurred, filling with tears I refused to let fall in front of the bride's smiling family, in front of strangers who would carry away the memory of my humiliation like gossip wrapped in pity. I clenched my jaw until it ached, willing myself to stay upright when all I wanted was to collapse into the floorboards and vanish. Inside my mind, disbelief struck first, then confusion, then pain so deep it stole my breath. I had imagined 100 versions of this day, none of them perfect, but all of them threaded with pride. I had thought of seeing my son beam with happiness, of shaking his hand with strength and whispering a father's blessing, of being immortalized beside him in the family photographs that would one day sit on mantels and shelves. I never imagined I would be erased, ordered to step away like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong frame. What had I done to deserve this? Where had I failed him so badly that he would see me as unworthy of standing by his side? The questions swarmed me like bees, stinging without answer, each one making the silence around me louder, heavier, unbearable. The laughter of the crowd echoed like distant bells, but to me it was muffled, blurred by the storm raging in my head. I did not hear words or voices, only the cruel roar of my own thoughts telling me over and over that I was not wanted. The silence that surrounded me was not peace. It was isolation, a hollow vacuum pressing in until I felt smaller than I had ever been. I could see mouths moving, see cameras flashing, but it all faded to the edges as though I was not truly there. My son's voice still lingered, cold and sharp, replaying in my ears like a sentence passed down without appeal. My heart begged me to walk forward, to demand a place, to remind him who I was and what I had given, but my legs were heavy as stone. I could not move. The weight of decades crashed down all at once. Every long shift, every aching muscle, every dream I had swallowed so that he could have more. I thought of the shoes I wore until they broke so he could have new ones. The hours of sleep I lost working so he could study, the pride I felt when he succeeded, believing all my sacrifice had meaning. In that moment, all of it felt like ash. The silence mocked me more than any insult ever could. It wrapped around me, smothering me until the crowd of people blurred into one faceless mass, and I realized I had never been more alone. My son was there, standing tall, smiling for the camera, but to him I was invisible, already erased. The sting of humiliation did not come only from my son's command, but from the way the room shifted in response. I could feel the eyes on me, some sharp and curious, others softened with pity that cut almost as deep as the rejection itself. A murmur rippled through the guests, low whispers exchanged just out of earshot, though I knew exactly what they were saying. Some turned away quickly, pretending not to notice the scene, as though averting their gaze might save me a fragment of dignity. Others looked straight at me, pity dripping from their faces, and that was somehow worse than if they had mocked me openly. I was no longer the proud father of the groom. I had become a spectacle, an object of sympathy, a man people pitied instead of respected. My son gave no indication that he even noticed. He did not pause, did not hesitate, did not glance in my direction to see if I was all right. His arm wrapped tightly around his bride, his smile beamed for the camera, and his new in-laws pulled close around him as though they had always been his true family. He posed for picture after picture, head held high, looking every bit the golden groom, while I faded into the background like a stain best forgotten. His laughter rang out, confident and unbroken, carrying no weight of guilt or shame for what he had done. That was what struck me the hardest, not just the rejection, but the ease with which he dismissed me, as though the moment meant nothing at all. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing thicker as whispers seemed to multiply. My body burned with shame, each step backward feeling like I was shrinking into nothingness. I wanted to speak, to call out his name, to remind him of who I was, but my throat locked tight, my voice silenced by the crushing realization that I no longer had a place in his life. My hand shook as I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself to retreat before I collapsed under the weight of so many eyes. With each step I took away from the group, I felt pieces of my heart breaking loose. The joy I had imagined for this day, the pride I had carried with me for decades, all of it shattered in an instant. I walked away quietly, each step echoing in my ears louder than the applause that followed the next set of photographs. My chest ached, my eyes burned, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I would not fall apart in front of the people who now whispered about the father who had been pushed aside. Behind me, my son never turned, never reached out, never looked to see where I had gone. He kept smiling, his arm tight around his bride, the camera flashes catching every angle of his joy while I slipped into the shadows. To him, the moment was perfect. To me, it was the cruelest betrayal I had ever endured. I left the room broken, humiliated, and utterly invisible, carrying with me the heavy knowledge that my son had chosen to erase me from his story. As I slipped away from the crowd, humiliation pressing against my chest like a vice, my mind betrayed me with memories of everything I had given to him, each one now tainted by the bitter truth of what he had become. I remembered the endless years of double shifts at the factory, where the machines roared so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts, and the ache in my body never truly left. I would rise before dawn, my hands stiff from yesterday's work, and return long after sunset, my clothes reeking of oil and sweat. There were days I skipped meals so he could have enough on his plate, telling him I wasn't hungry when the truth was my stomach twisted in knots from emptiness. Every dollar I earned, every penny I saved, I funneled toward his future. While other men bought new cars or took vacations, I patched up the same old truck with my own hands and told myself it was worth it, because one day my boy would have more than I ever did. I can still see the stack of bills spread across the kitchen table, my paychecks already spoken for before they were even cashed. Rent, food, clothes, and always something set aside for his education. I clipped coupons until my fingers cramped, wore the same coat winter after winter, and lived with holes in my shoes so he could walk proudly in new ones. Every decision I made, no matter how small, bent toward his benefit. I built my life around the promise that he would not have to struggle the way I had. And yet it wasn't only sacrifice and hardship. There were moments of pure joy, too, the kind that carried me through the darkest days. I remember tucking him into bed, his little arms wrapping around my neck as he begged for just one more story. I would sit beside him, bone-tired but smiling, spinning tales until his eyelids grew heavy and his breathing softened. Those quiet nights felt like a reward greater than anything money could buy. I remember the afternoons hunched over the kitchen table, guiding his hand across the page as he stumbled through his homework. The way his eyes lit up when he finally solved a problem made me prouder than any accomplishment of my own. There were times I would watch him play in the yard, laughter spilling into the air as he chased a ball or climbed a tree, and I told myself every aching muscle and every empty belly was worth it for that smile. Even when exhaustion left me barely able to stand, I pushed through, because nothing mattered more than seeing him thrive. I thought I was laying the foundation of a bond that could never be broken, that one day he would look back and understand what it had cost to give him the life he enjoyed. But standing there at his wedding, unwelcome in the very pictures that should have celebrated our bond, I realized those sacrifices had been written in invisible ink. The double shifts, the missed meals, the nights I carried him to bed after falling asleep in my lap, they meant everything to me, but to him they meant nothing. I gave him my strength, my time, my very life, and he rewarded me with erasure. Even as I stood drowning in the sting of exclusion, my mind wandered back to moments that should have warned me of what was to come, signs of the ingratitude that had always simmered beneath the surface. I remembered the first time I saw it in his eyes, that look of disdain directed not at strangers but at me, his own father. He was 15, standing in the hallway, with a new jacket I had picked out from the thrift store draped across his shoulders. It wasn't flashy, but it was sturdy, warm, and all I could afford after scraping through another month of bills. Instead of gratitude, instead of even the simple decency of a thank you, he sneered, his lips curling with disgust. Why can't I ever have something new? Everyone's going to laugh at me wearing this second-hand junk. His words sliced through me sharper than any blade, but what gutted me more was the contempt in his voice. I tried to explain that clothes didn't make the man, that pride came from within, but he rolled his eyes and stormed off, leaving me standing there with the weight of failure pressing down on me. Not long after that came another moment, burned so clearly into my memory it still feels fresh. My old car, the one I had kept running with duct tape and elbow grease, coughed and wheezed as I pulled up to the school to pick him up. I had skipped repairs for myself more times than I could count so I could keep that car alive, just to drive him safely to school and back. As he slid into the seat, he groaned loudly, looking around to see if anyone was watching. "Why do you have to drive this piece of junk? It's embarrassing. Couldn't you at least try to get a real car?" The shame in his voice wasn't for the broken-down engine or the dented fenders. It was for me. I smiled weakly, swallowing my hurt, and told him someday he'd understand the value of what I was doing. But deep down, a part of me knew he wasn't listening. Years passed, and the gap between us only widened. When he was older, I tried to give him advice about work, about saving money, about building a life through persistence and discipline. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, smirking as though my words were meaningless. "Dad, times have changed. Your advice is old-fashioned. Nobody does things that way anymore." I sat there, silent, the sting of his arrogance cutting deeper than the sharpest insult. He did not see the wisdom earned through years of hardship, the lessons carved into my bones through trial and sacrifice. He saw only an outdated relic, someone whose voice carried no weight in the modern world he thought he owned. I held on to hope, convincing myself these were just phases, the careless cruelty of youth. I told myself he would mature, that one day he would look back and understand, that he would see me not as an obstacle but as the man who built the path beneath his feet. But as I stood at his wedding, cast aside like I had been so many times before, I realized that those moments were not phases. They were warnings. He had always carried ingratitude in his heart. The sneers, the dismissals, the arrogance, they were not fleeting storms. They were glimpses of the man he had become, a man who would erase his own father without a second thought. ChatGPT said. When I returned home from the wedding, the silence of the house struck me harder than the rejection itself. The door closed behind me with a hollow echo, and for the first time in years, the place I had built with my own hands felt foreign, stripped of warmth, stripped of meaning. I lowered myself into the old chair by the window, the same chair where I had once held him on my lap as a boy, and stared into the shadows that pooled across the room. The stillness was unbearable, pressing down on me until even the sound of my own breathing felt like an intrusion. I sat motionless, replaying the moment again and again, his cold voice ordering me to step aside, the laughter of the guests rising up like a cruel chorus behind it. My eyes wandered across the room and landed on the photo frames that lined the shelves and walls. So many years captured in those pictures. His first steps, his awkward smile at school, the graduations, the birthdays. Each frame told a story, each one a testament to the love I had poured into his life. But as I looked at them now, they mocked me. The images I had treasured for so long seemed to blur and fade, because what good were memories when he had chosen to erase me from his? Those frames that once symbolized pride now felt like hollow shells, reminders that everything I had given him had led to this final betrayal. I reached for one of the photos, my fingers trembling as I traced the smiling face of a boy who had once looked at me with trust and love. That boy no longer existed. He had grown into a man who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, someone to be cut out of the most important day of his life. My throat tightened, and the tears I had held back at the wedding finally came, falling hot and unrelenting. I let them run until my chest ached from the force of my sobs, until my body could no longer hold the weight of grief. But tears dry, as they always do, and when they did, what remained was not sorrow, plans, it was bitterness. I sat there, hollow and broken, but slowly the sadness hardened into something sharper, something colder. I thought of the decades I had spent given, every sacrifice, every lost hour, every dream I had abandoned so he could chase his own. What had it all been for? What was the point of bleeding for a son who could so easily discard me? The truth sank in with a cruel finality. It had been wasted. Decades of giving, decades of building, decades of love, all of it thrown aside with a single dismissive command. The house around me, once filled with meaning, now felt like a tomb. The silence was not peace, but condemnation, reminding me again and again of the reality I had tried so hard to deny. My son had erased me, and I was left with nothing but memories turned to ash. That night, as the bitterness settled into my bones, I made myself a promise. Never again would I let him use me. Never again would I allow myself to be humiliated in the name of love. Something had broken inside me, and what replaced it was resolve. The questions that had clawed at me in the hours after the wedding began to quiet, not because I found comfort, but because they no longer served me. At first they had consumed me. Why would he do this to me after everything I had given? How could he erase me from a day that should have honored both of us? Why was I never enough for him? They circled endlessly, tormenting me with every breath. But as the night stretched on and the silence pressed against me like a weight, the questions hardened into something else. I no longer asked why. I began to tell myself the truth. He will never use me again. He has shown me exactly who he is, and I will believe him. The shift was slow, like frost spreading across glass, but once it began, it was unstoppable. I rose from the chair and walked into the kitchen, the light dim and pale against the worn walls. On the counter lay the wedding invitation, carefully placed there weeks ago as though it had been something precious. The thick cardstock, the elegant lettering, all of it mocked me now. It was the promise of a day I had once imagined would be filled with pride, a promise broken so brutally it left scars. I picked it up, the paper soft but heavy in my hand, and for a moment I simply stared at it, feeling the anger simmer beneath my skin. This invitation had once been a symbol of family, of love, of belonging. Now it was nothing but a reminder of betrayal. I set it in a shallow dish on the table and struck a match. The flame flared to life with a sharp hiss, the smell of sulfur curling into the air. I held the fire to the corner of the invitation, and within seconds the paper caught, curling black as orange tongues devoured the words. I watched silently as the names, the date, the promises printed in gold ink disappeared into ash. The fire crackled softly, and in its destruction I found a grim sense of clarity. I was no longer grieving, I was deciding. As the last fragments crumbled into nothing, I whispered words I had never spoken aloud before. He has erased me. Now I will erase him. My hands no longer trembled. My chest no longer felt crushed beneath invisible weight. Instead, I felt steady, cold, deliberate. Every tear I had shed earlier that night seemed to transform into steel within me. I realized then that love without respect was nothing but chains, and I had carried those chains for far too long. The ashes of the invitation lay in the dish, gray and lifeless, a fitting symbol of what our relationship had become. I carried the dish to the sink and let the remnants wash away, the water sweeping them down the drain. Just like that, the promise of his wedding was gone, and with it, any illusion I had left. I turned from the sink, my steps firmer than they had been in years, and felt a new voice rising inside me, one that no longer pleaded for understanding but promised retribution. He will never use me again. He may have erased me from his photographs, but I would erase him from something far greater. Morning light found me at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a steadying cup of coffee, the room still cold from the night, as if the house itself had braced for what I was about to do. I unlocked the old metal filing cabinet with a small brass key I had kept on my ring for decades, the same cabinet that had stored every plan for his future, and I pulled out the files one by one. Taxes, mortgage, insurance, investments. Each manila folder slid open beneath my hands, neat stacks of statements and photocopies arranged in the order I had always kept them, because order was the only way I had ever made a hard life survivable. I laid them on the table and began to read. Account numbers, balances, beneficiary forms, checking, savings, brokerage, certificates of deposit I had rolled over again and again. Rather than spend a dime on myself, I made a list as I went, writing carefully on the legal pad. Will, to be replaced entirely. Beneficiaries on all accounts to be updated. Title to the house, to clarify succession. Retirement account, to designate a new recipient. Life insurance, review payout to remove his name. I turned each page with calm fingers and felt that calm grow as the pile of evidence gathered before me. This was not grief anymore. It was arithmetic. It was structure. It was a life reorganized around a truth I could finally accept. I dug deeper into the cabinet and found the last version of my will, the one drafted when he was in college, when every sentence was written with the optimism of a father who believed gratitude would bloom naturally in his son. I read the clauses and penciled notes in the margin, specific bequests to be reallocated, residuary estate to be redirected entirely, executor to be changed, no contest clause to be tightened. I cross-referenced with the bank statements and circled the items that would need immediate attention. Then I reached for the narrow lockbox on the bottom shelf, entered the combination by muscle memory, and pulled out the folder marked Personal. Inside were passports, birth certificates, and the card for my attorney, a woman who had handled my refinance years ago with the kind of precise competence a man can trust. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, not because they were sweaty, but because I wanted every movement to be clean, deliberate, final. I picked up the phone and dialed the number, listening to it ring while I stared at the burned rim of the dish where the invitation had turned to ash. Hello? This is Rivera Law. How can we help you today? I need to revise my will immediately. My name is Daniel Hart. You handled my refinance a few years back and prepared a draft will then. I want the old document replaced in full, and I want to update all related instruments. Of course, Mr. Hart. I can pull up your file. Are there any urgent considerations I should note before we schedule? Yes. Remove my son as a beneficiary and as executor. Add a no contest clause with teeth. I will provide a list of new beneficiaries and a letter of intent for charitable disbursements. I want all language airtight. Understood. I have an opening this afternoon. If you can bring current account statements and the prior documents, we can prepare a full replacement and get signatures notarized. I have everything ready. I will be there. I ended the call and set the phone beside the legal pad, then gathered the statements into fresh folders, labeling each with a black marker. Bank accounts to retitle, investment accounts to update, insurance to amend, house deed to review. I clipped the old will on top of the stack as a reminder to destroy it once the new one was executed, not out of spite but to clear the path for what must stand. I added a separate page of directives for after the meeting: call each institution for beneficiary change forms, schedule a quitclaim consultation if needed, draft a letter to the executor detailing my intentions and the reasons, not to feed drama, but to record truth. I checked the clock, drank the last of the coffee, and slid the folders into a worn leather briefcase. Every act had a purpose now. Revenge was no longer heat in my chest. It was a plan written in ink, a sequence of steps that would move my life from wounded to protected. I turned off the kitchen light, and the house settled around me with a quiet that felt different, not empty, not accusatory. It felt like agreement. The law office smelled faintly of polished wood and leather-bound books, a place where every word carried weight and every decision became permanent. I arrived with my briefcase heavy with documents, my steps measured, my face composed. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and guided me to a quiet conference room. Within minutes, Attorney Rivera entered, her presence calm but commanding, the kind of professional who made you believe that no matter how tangled a situation became, she could untie it without hesitation. She extended her hand firmly, her eyes steady, inviting me to speak. I laid the stack of files on the table, sliding them toward her in careful order. "I want my will rewritten," I said, my voice low but unwavering. "Completely. My son is to be removed in every capacity: beneficiary, executor, any mention. I want language in place to make sure this decision cannot be challenged." She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why in the way friends or family might have, with pity or judgment. She nodded once, pulled the old will from the folder, and began to read. Her pen moved swiftly across the page, making small marks in the margins as she listened to me speak. I explained what needed to be done: reallocating the estate, redirecting funds, revising titles, and she followed each word with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "You are within your full rights," she said firmly. "A will is your voice on paper. It is yours to decide, and no one has the power to take that from you. If your intent is to remove him, we will remove him completely. I will draft airtight provisions to ensure there are no successful contests. Your estate will go exactly where you want it to go." Those words settled in my chest like iron. She did not question whether I was justified. She did not suggest compromise or reconciliation. She treated my decision as final, valid, and entirely in my control. For the first time since the wedding, I felt the dignity return to me, the sense that I was no longer at the mercy of my son's arrogance, but standing in the authority of my own choices. She walked me through each document with methodical care. The will would be replaced in its entirety. A new executor would be named, someone trustworthy, impartial. Specific assets would be reallocated, charitable donations outlined clearly, and a no-contest clause written with language so firm that any attempt to dispute would cost the challenger more than they could ever hope to gain. Every suggestion she made, every revision she proposed, underscored the seriousness of what I was doing. This was not vengeance scribbled in anger. This was law, structured and binding. When the meeting ended, she slid the draft across the table with calm finality. "We'll have this notarized today if you're ready." she said. I pressed my pen to the page and signed without hesitation. The scratch of ink on paper was the sound of justice, the sound of a father reclaiming his voice. She gathered the signed pages neatly, her efficiency sealing the act, and looked at me with professional certainty. It's done. He cannot touch what is no longer his. Walking out of that office, briefcase lighter, heart steadier, I realized I had found more than a lawyer. I had found an ally, someone who validated my resolve with the authority of the law, someone who had turned my bitterness into a plan that could not be undone. Back home, I spread the documents across the dining table and stared at the figures, the deeds, the statements, all of it, the sum of a lifetime of labor. For years I had thought of this as my son's inheritance, the safety net I had built so he would never know the hunger and strain that had marked my own youth. But now, stripped of that illusion, I was free to ask myself a question I had never dared to before. If not him, then who? Where should my life's work go when I no longer walked this earth? The first thought that came was of my nieces and nephews, children who had never asked me for more than a smile and a listening ear. They had visited on holidays, had written me notes of thanks when I slipped a few dollars into their birthday cards, and had never treated me as though I was merely a wallet. They had shown respect not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was to them. I pictured their faces lighting up with surprise and gratitude if they ever discovered that the quiet old uncle had left them something to make their lives easier. That thought warmed me. Then I considered charity. I had lived through hardship, through long nights where the cupboards were thin and the rent seemed impossible. I knew the desperation of counting coins to buy bread, the ache of working through pain because stopping wasn't an option. To give a portion of my estate to families like the one I had grown up in, put food on tables, coats on children's backs, felt like honoring the boy I once was, the one who swore he would give his own child a better life. Perhaps that vow had been wasted on my son, but it did not have to be wasted altogether. Another idea bloomed slowly but with power, a scholarship fund in my name. Education had been the one thing I fought hardest to provide for my son, pouring every spare dollar into tuition, books, and fees. He had taken it all for granted, but someone else might not. Someone else might use that chance to climb where I had scraped and clawed. Someone who would remember the name attached to their opportunity and carry it with respect. A scholarship would be more than money. It would be legacy, a piece of me living on in grateful hearts rather than entitled hands. As I weighed each option, I noticed a quiet sense of peace slipping in where bitterness had once sat. This was not only revenge, this was reclamation. My estate, my years of labor, would not be wasted on someone who mocked my sacrifices and erased me from his life. They would go where they were wanted, where they would make a difference, where they would be honored. Each decision I considered contrasted sharply with the image of my son's smug face, his dismissive tone, his arrogance. He would never know the gratitude these others might show because he had chosen entitlement over respect. I gathered my notes into a clean stack and wrote out potential distributions, each line another step away from him and another step toward dignity. For the first time in days, I felt a strange calm, as though the house itself approved, the silence no longer suffocating but supportive. I looked at the numbers not as a father betrayed, but as a man reclaiming control of his story. My son had chosen to erase me. I was choosing to leave my mark where it would matter. The phone rang 2 nights after the wedding, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of my house. I stared at the screen, his name flashing, my pulse tightening in my throat. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, sparing myself the sound of his voice, but something in me wanted to hear what excuse, if any, he might offer. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear with a steadiness I did not feel. "Hey, Dad," he said casually, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't humiliated me in front of 100 people. His tone was light, almost cheerful, and it sent a fresh wave of heat crawling up my neck. I said nothing, waiting. He chuckled, a hollow sound, and continued, "I hope you're not still sulking about the pictures. You'll get over it. It's not that big of a deal." The words dropped like stones into my chest. Not that big of a deal? The dismissal in his voice was worse than the exclusion itself. It was as though the decades I had sacrificed, the nights I had gone without so he could have, the very blood and sweat I had poured into his life, amounted to nothing more than an inconvenience he expected me to shrug off. "You think erasing me from your wedding day is nothing?" I asked quietly, my voice low and flat. He sighed, the kind of sigh a spoiled child gives when asked to clean his room. "Dad, you're being dramatic. It was just for the professional shots. We didn't want things to get complicated. You know how it is. But it doesn't mean anything. You're overreacting. Come on, just let it go." The audacity in his tone was staggering. He had drawn a line through me in the most public way possible, and now he wanted to pretend it was harmless, that my pain was nothing more than an overreaction. He wanted me to swallow it quietly, to return to my role as the father who gave without question, who endured without complaint, but I wasn't that man anymore. "I see," I said, forcing calm into every syllable. My chest was tight, but my mind was clear. He rushed on, as if eager to end the call. "Anyway, we'll come by soon. Maybe you can help with a down payment on a new place. The wedding cost a fortune, and we could use some support. You know, like you've always done." His voice carried no hesitation, no shame, just expectation, as though nothing had changed, as though I still existed only to fund his ambitions. That was the moment the last trace of doubt left me. The will had to be rewritten, not just adjusted but wiped clean of his name. He had not only erased me from his photographs, he had erased me from his respect, from his gratitude, from his heart. I ended the call without another word, my hand steady as I set the phone down on the table. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was sharp, decisive, filled with the echo of a promise I would keep. He thought I would get over it. He was wrong. What he would never get over was the day he discovered what his arrogance had cost him. As I sat in the quiet after his arrogant phone call, another memory rose unbidden, so vivid it felt as though the words had just been spoken. It was years ago, before the wedding, before the final insult, yet the sting of it still lingered like a scar across my heart. He had been in his 20s then, brash and confident, strutting through life as though the world already belonged to him. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, bills spread out in front of me, when he came in asking for money. Not politely, not humbly, asking in that entitled tone that assumed the answer would be yes, as though my labor existed only to serve his whims. "Dad, I need you to cover my rent this month. Things are tight," he had said, tossing his keys on the counter, his phone already in his hand, as though the request required no explanation. I looked up at him, weary but calm, and asked, "Son, when does it end? You've got a good job now. When will you learn to stand on your own?" He smirked then, a cruel twist of his lips that should have told me everything I needed to know. Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Come on, Dad. You're just a bank to me. That's what parents are for, right?" He laughed afterward, as though it were a harmless joke, but the words carried the weight of truth. They revealed the heart of how he saw me, not as a father, not as a man who had sacrificed everything for him, but as a source of money, a resource to be tapped whenever he pleased. I remember the way my stomach sank, how the words lodged in my chest like a stone. I wanted to believe it was thoughtless banter, that he hadn't meant it, but deep down I knew better. His laughter was too easy, too careless. It was not the nervous chuckle of someone who misspoke. It was the relaxed confidence of someone revealing what they had always believed. In that moment, I saw clearly for the first time what I had refused to admit for years. To him, I was not a father. I was a wallet with a face. That memory resurfaced now with haunting clarity, every detail sharpened by the cruelty of what he had done at his wedding. The arrogance in his tone, the dismissiveness in his eyes, the smirk that told me he thought he would never face consequences. It was all the same. The boy who had sneered at thrift store clothes, the young man who mocked my old car, the adult who joked about me being nothing more than a bank, they were all one and the same person. Nothing had changed. He had simply grown bolder, more certain that I would always bend, always give, always endure. But he was wrong. That old conversation had been a warning, a glimpse into his true nature. I had ignored it then, choosing love over clarity, but I could not ignore it now. His words from all those years ago rang in my ears like a prophecy of his downfall. Just a bank. He had reduced me to that title, and in doing so, he had written his own fate. For what happens when a bank closes its doors? The customer is left with nothing. That was the truth he would soon learn, carved not in words, but in the silence of an inheritance that would never come. The conference room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the overhead light and the shuffle of papers being set before me. The lawyer slid the final draft across the polished oak table, her expression steady, professional, as though she understood the gravity of what I was about to do, but also respected that it was mine alone to carry. I looked down at the pages, the clean black print spelling out a future I had chosen with cold clarity. My son's name, once woven into every clause and provision, was gone. In its place were the names of people who had shown me respect, charities that would use the money to lift others, a scholarship fund that would bear my name. Every line of text was a rebuke, every word a reminder that love without gratitude is worthless. My hand hovered above the page for a long moment, pen resting between my fingers, my heart steady but heavy. I thought of him then, not as the man who had dismissed me at his wedding, not as the entitled adult demanding more money, but as the little boy who had once clung to my leg and begged me never to leave. That boy was gone, replaced by someone colder, someone who saw me only as a resource. I inhaled slowly, letting that truth wash through me, and then I put pen to paper. The nib scratched across the surface, steady and deliberate, each signature a stroke that cut away the last remnants of illusion. The sound echoed in my ears like nails sealing a coffin, not of a person but of the bond I had once believed unbreakable. When I finished, I pushed the pen forward and leaned back in my chair. Attorney Rivera gathered the documents, checking each signature with her practiced eye, and then slipped them into a folder with finality. "It's done," she said softly, her tone carrying no judgment, only the weight of certainty. "This will is airtight. He cannot undo this." I nodded, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in days. A strange lightness filled me, as though the burden of decades had been lifted. Betrayal still lingered, yes, but now It had been met with consequence, shaped into something tangible and binding. Justice was no longer just an idea burning in my chest. It was written in ink, notarized, and filed. I rose from my chair, shook her hand firmly, and left the office with my briefcase lighter and my steps steadier. The city outside bustled with life, people rushing past me with their own worries and joys, but I walked with a calm detachment, a man who had made peace with his decision. The papers in my briefcase were more than legal documents. They were a shield, a declaration, a monument to the truth that respect cannot be bought and love cannot be faked. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized I was not leaving the office with bitterness, but with relief. He had erased me from his wedding photographs, but I had erased him from my legacy. And in that exchange, I had finally regained control of my life. The folder of signed documents rested between us on the table, its weight far greater than the thin sheaf of papers suggested. Attorney Rivera adjusted her glasses, her tone even but unmistakably firm as she explained the protection she had built into every clause. "This will is airtight, Mr. Hart. We've included a no-contest provision. EFA, if he or anyone else tries to challenge it, they forfeit any right to what little they might have received. The executor is impartial and legally bound. Beneficiary designations are updated on every account to align with the will. There are no gaps, no ambiguities, no loose ends he could exploit." She tapped the folder lightly, the gesture final and precise. "He may be arrogant, but arrogance won't win against this." I sat back, letting her words settle in, a quiet satisfaction building inside me. For years, my son had believed he was untouchable, that he could sneer at my sacrifices, dismiss my advice, humiliate me publicly, and still claim what I had built. He assumed blood-guaranteed entitlement, that no matter how he treated me, my legacy was his by default. But now, for the first time, I knew with certainty that his arrogance would collide with a wall he could not climb. He had erased me with cruelty, but he had also revealed his blind spot, his belief that I would never act. Attorney Rivera continued, outlining the additional measures she had taken. The charitable trust language is ironclad. The scholarship fund is established with clear guidelines and oversight, so it cannot be redirected. The nieces and nephews you've named will inherit directly, bypassing probate entirely. Even if he tries to claim undue influence or diminished capacity, your medical records and long-term documentation of independence will shut that down. We've closed every door." I nodded, my lips curving into a faint, controlled smile. It was not the smile of a man celebrating victory, but of one savoring inevitability. My son had always counted on my silence, my compliance, my endless willingness to forgive. He would never expect that his own father had already erased him in return, not in anger, but in ink. One day, when I was gone, he would discover the truth in the cold language of legal documents, and his outrage would meet only indifference from the law. The thought brought me no joy, only a calm sense of balance. I didn't need to shout at him, didn't need to beg him to understand, didn't need to make him see the pain he caused. The will itself was my voice, stronger than any argument, louder than any protest. It was a voice he could not silence or ignore. As I gathered the papers back into my briefcase, I glanced once more at the lawyer. "Thank you," I said simply. She nodded, professional to the end, but I thought I caught the briefest flicker of understanding in her eyes, a recognition that this was more than law. This was justice. When I stepped out into the cool evening air, I smiled quietly to myself. He thought he had cut me from his future, but the truth was waiting, patient and immovable, sealed by law. One day, his arrogance would slam headlong into it, and the sound of that collision would be the only echo of my revenge. It didn't take long for whispers to spread, as they always do in families where pride and entitlement run deep. I had told no one but my lawyer of the changes I made, but papers have a way of leaving traces. New beneficiaries notified, institutions updating records, small ripples that move outward until they become waves. Soon enough, my son heard the first rumors. A cousin mentioned offhand that she had been asked to provide information for estate purposes. A nephew joked that Uncle Dan was more generous than he let on. The details were vague, but they were enough to spark curiosity, enough to plant the seed that perhaps his inheritance was not as secure as he believed. When the whispers reached him, he brushed them off with the same arrogance he had shown me his entire life. Sitting at the dinner table with his new bride and her family, he laughed, raising a glass as though the very idea was ridiculous. "The old man wouldn't dare," he said, shaking his head with a smug grin. "He's been threatening that kind of thing my whole life. He's too soft. He doesn't have it in him." His words were met with polite chuckles, though I imagined some in that room noticed the edge of unease beneath his bravado. But he ignored it, basking in his own certainty that I was still the man he could walk over without consequence. His wife, less familiar with the family dynamics, asked gently, "But what if he did change something? What if he meant it?" He waved her concern away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Trust me, he's all bark. He doesn't have the backbone to cut me out. I'm his only son. He'll get over it, like he always does." The room erupted with laughter again, and he leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the story he had spun. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that this time I had already acted. I had put pen to paper, signed the documents, and filed them under lock and seal. His arrogance, his blind confidence in my endless forgiveness, was the very thing that would make the truth hit him like a hammer when the time came. He laughed that night, certain he held all the power, certain he was untouchable. But each chuckle, each boastful word only tightened the noose of irony around his neck. I wasn't there to hear his words, but I didn't need to be. I knew him well enough to imagine them clearly, the smirk on his face, the smugness in his tone. And I knew, too, that arrogance like his could not last forever. The stage was set, the lines already written. One day soon, his laughter would fall silent, replaced by disbelief, rage, and the bitter taste of consequence. The whispers would become truth, and when he finally faced it, there would be no room left for denial. The old man had dared, the old man had acted, and the wall he thought would never exist was already standing in his path, waiting. ChatGPT said, the confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon, not long after the whispers had grown too loud for him to ignore. He arrived at my house unannounced, the sound of his car door slamming carrying the impatience that had marked him since boyhood. I opened the door and saw him standing there, face tight with barely contained frustration, his wife lingering behind him with an uncertain expression. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pushed past me into the living room, his voice already raised. "Dad, I've been hearing things. People are saying you've been changing papers, moving money, cutting me out of things. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't actually do this." I closed the door quietly and turned to face him, my hands steady at my sides. "It's true," I said simply. He blinked, thrown off by the calmness in my voice. "What do you mean it's true? You can't be serious. You'd never do that. I'm your son." I held his gaze, my voice firm but low, every word chosen with precision. You erased me from your photos. I erased you from my legacy. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Then he erupted, his face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists. Are you kidding me? Over a few stupid pictures? You're going to throw away everything over that? Do you have any idea what people will say? Do you have any idea what you're doing to me? His wife shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. The volume of his rage carried down the hallway, drawing the attention of my neighbors through the open window. He didn't notice. He was too consumed by his fury. You can't do this, he shouted, pacing across the room. I deserve that money. Everything you have, you built for me. That's mine. You can't just decide to give it away like it means nothing. I stayed seated, my voice calm, even as his anger shook the walls. It was never yours. It was mine. And I choose where it goes. You made your choice the day you decided I wasn't worthy of being in your life. Now you will live with mine. His voice cracked with desperation as his words spilled out faster, more vicious. You're cruel. You're vindictive. You're ruining my life because you're too sensitive to handle one small thing. You've lost your mind. But the more he raged, the more he revealed himself. His words were not about love, not about family, not about reconciliation. They were about entitlement, about money, about losing the inheritance he thought untouchable. His greed filled the room, poisoning the air until even his wife lowered her eyes in shame. I let him rant, let his voice carry out the open window where others could hear, until finally his breath came in ragged gasps. Then I stood, straightened my shoulders, and said quietly, "This is not punishment, it is consequence. You erased me. Now I have erased you. That is all." He stared at me, trembling with rage, but I saw something flicker behind his eyes, then fear. The realization that for the first time in his life, I had acted, and nothing he said could undo it. Word of the confrontation spread faster than I could have imagined, carried on the backs of neighbors who had overheard his shouting and relatives who wasted no time repeating what they'd been told. By the next family gathering, the story was no longer rumor, it was fact. My son had been cut out of my will, and everyone knew why. He arrived with his bride, his posture stiff, his smile strained, but the whispers began the moment he stepped through the door. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, conversations hushed as people watched him, waiting for him to prove the gossip wrong. But arrogance has a way of exposing itself, and he did not disappoint. When one cousin, braver than the rest, asked him directly if it was true, he laughed too loudly, his voice cracking under the weight of his own performance. Of course it's not true. My dad wouldn't dare do something like that. He's just being dramatic. Everyone knows he wouldn't cut me off. The words were meant to reassure, but the dismissive tone only fueled the murmurs. His bride's cheeks flushed, her hands tightening around her glass as she realized the eyes in the room were no longer admiring, they were scrutinizing. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, observing without speaking, letting the silence of my presence confirm more than words ever could. When someone asked me directly, I didn't lie, nor did I soften the truth. "It's done," I said calmly. "The will is changed. He will receive nothing." The room fell into stunned silence for a moment, and then the whispers erupted like a hive disturbed. My son's face reddened, his composure breaking. "You can't just say that in front of everyone," he snapped at me, his voice carrying through the room. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" His words betrayed him instantly. The concern not about what he had done, but about appearances, about pride, about the image he had so carefully constructed. The relatives recoiled, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. Friends exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his entitlement laid bare for all to see. Even those who had once defended him could no longer ignore the venom in his tone, the greed that dripped from every word. His bride stared at him in shock, her face pale, as if she was only just beginning to see the man she had married in full light. "Look at you," one aunt whispered, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Raging over money while your father sits there with dignity. Shameful." Others nodded in agreement, the tide of judgment turning against him faster than he could recover. He tried to argue, tried to twist the narrative, but the more he spoke, the deeper he sank. His arrogance was no longer hidden behind smiles and charm. It stood naked in the middle of the room, undeniable and ugly. By the time the evening ended, his reputation lay in tatters, shredded not by my hand but by his own words. I said little, because little was needed. My silence was louder than his shouting, my calm more powerful than his fury. He had humiliated me at his wedding, but now it was his turn to taste humiliation. And unlike me, he had no dignity left to salvage. For the first time in years, I felt peace settle over me like a long-awaited dawn. It was not the kind of peace born from comfort or wealth, nor from pretending the past hadn't happened. It was the peace of justice, of balance restored. For decades, I had carried the burden of sacrifice without gratitude, giving endlessly to a son who saw me only as a tool, a bank, a man whose worth ended at the moment he said no. That weight had bent my back, hollowed out my chest, and convinced me that love meant enduring humiliation in silence. But now, the silence was different. It no longer suffocated me, it soothed me. The will was changed, the truth was known, and my son's mask of entitlement had slipped before everyone who once admired him. He could no longer exploit me, no longer sneer and demand while assuming I would always bend. The leash he had looped around my life for years was cut clean through, and I breathed freely for the first time in longer than I could remember. He had erased me from his photographs, but I had erased him from my legacy, and the irony of that symmetry filled me with a grim sense of satisfaction. I thought back to the long nights of work, the missed meals, the old truck patched together with wire and hope, the small sacrifices that had piled into a mountain of devotion. For years, I believed those sacrifices chained me to him, that because I had given so much, I was forever bound to keep giving. But I see it differently now. Those sacrifices built me too. They gave me strength, endurance, and the clarity to know when enough is enough. They prepared me for the moment when I had to stand alone and reclaim my dignity. I walked through the house and looked again at the photographs that had once tormented me with reminders of wasted devotion. Now, they no longer mocked me. They told the truth of who I had been, a father who gave, who worked, who cared. Those pictures were mine, not his, and though he had chosen to erase me from his story, he could never erase himself from mine. The difference was I no longer wanted him there. Vindication is not loud, it is not shouting or boasting, it is quiet, steady, immovable. It is the calm knowledge that justice has been served and that no further words are needed. My son would rage, he would scheme, he would curse my name, but none of it mattered. The ink was dry, the decisions final. He could hurl his anger at the walls of the world, but they would not bend. And in that truth, I found freedom. Freedom from being used, freedom from being diminished, freedom from carrying the weight of a bond that existed only on one side. My son was no longer my burden, no longer my responsibility, no longer my heir. He had chosen arrogance over love, entitlement over gratitude, and I had chosen peace over pain. For the first time in years, I was truly free. He erased me from a picture, so I erased him from my future. The symmetry of it still lingers in my mind, sharp and undeniable, like two lines drawn in opposite directions that never meet again. At his wedding, in front of friends, family, and strangers, he decided I did not belong. With a single command, he cut me from the frame, as though decades of sacrifice and love could be wiped away as easily as stepping out of a shot. And so, with my own pen, I returned the gesture, removing him not from a fleeting photograph but from the story of everything I had built across a lifetime. His erasure was temporary, a moment that would fade with time. Mine was final, written in ink and sealed by law, a truth he could never undo. There is a bitter poetry in it, a balance he will never see until it is too late. One day, when the documents are unsealed, he will face the consequence of his arrogance, and in that moment, he will finally understand what it means to be excluded. But I will not be there to see his face twist with anger, or his voice crack with disbelief. My revenge is not about witnessing his downfall. It is about ensuring that, when the time comes, the world will know that betrayal carries a cost. This is the moral I leave behind, carved not in lectures or sermons, but in action. Love cannot be treated as expendable, sacrifice cannot be mocked, and respect cannot be withheld without consequence. Justice does not always arrive in thunder and fury. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the calm scratch of a pen across paper, in the silence of a father who will no longer be used. My son believed he had the power to erase me, but the truth is he only revealed himself. And in revealing himself, he gave me the strength to write him out of the future he thought was guaranteed. The photograph from his wedding will hang on walls and mantels, a curated memory of smiles and joy. My absence, an empty space in the frame. But my legacy, the house, the savings, the years of labor crystallized into security, will never be his to claim. Others will inherit. Others will remember me with gratitude, and he will be left with nothing but the hollow echo of his own choices. He erased me from a picture, but I erased him from everything that mattered. That is the final image, the last word, the justice I chose. Not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but out of the simple truth that every betrayal deserves its consequence. And so I leave this story as proof. You cannot cut someone from your life without expecting them one day to cut you from theirs. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.